G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And few ideas are more dangerous than the notion that a targeted assassination or terrorism, public executions and personal retribution can be permissible in a peaceful society if they achieve greater ends. This is something that seems to have been baked into so many people's responses to the assassination on December 4th of the CEO of United Healthcare, one of the biggest private health insurers in the United States, brazenly on the streets of New York City. The CEO's wife calls it a senseless killing. But senseless isn't exactly right, not if you pay attention to the way that people are reacting, especially on social media. There was a lot of consternation and gloating at the same time. A lot of a sense that this is a moment when Americans have to reckon with the moral seriousness of what the private health insurance industry is up to, specifically CEOs like Brian Thompson, who had taken such an aggressive approach towards maximizing profits and denying claims, deploying even things like artificial intelligence to identify the most lucrative ways to deny coverage to their customers. All of the chatter around this had always been qualified with a line like, or almost always, assassinations, of course, are terrible and murder is never justified, but. And that word but has been banging around in my noggin and doing an enormous amount of work. Why do we feel the need to reflexively invoke the murder is never justified claim if we're then going on to say that the things that this victim did were beyond the pale? I had initially also ruled out any consideration of the question about whether or not murder could ever be justified. It sounds embarrassing even to broach this subject because it's so obvious the kind of blowback and misinterpretation that can come from it. So let me say right now, murder is never justified in my opinion. But you have to sort of also wrestle with why. You have to sort of also wrestle with the points that are being made in things like the Unabomber's Manifesto by Ted Kaczynski that the alleged suspect of these shootings had read, apparently, and admired. Why is it that a person could preside over an organization that unleashes calamitous harm against individuals and be so morally blameless that any retribution is prima facie unjustified? So I had been thinking, yeah, of course murder is bad. Of course these people are all being silly online. And then I read some stats about what this CEO had done to United Healthcare. The company's share price when he took over in April of 2021 was $370. He's taken it up to $630 from $370. Not quite doubling, but pretty good. They made $16.4 billion in profit last year, and he was paid $10.2 million rather. There have been numerous reports by journalistic outlets like ProPublica on the ridiculous trouble that the company has gone through so that it can deny claims, like one to a chronically ill man who had all sorts of very coverable medical problems. There's been a Senate committee into United Healthcare saying that they systematically deny solid claims from Medicare Advantage patients, these are older Americans, to pad their margins, and that they do so with the help of artificial intelligence. There was a lawsuit last year against United Healthcare brought by a chronically ill college student who says he was saddled with $800,000 in medical bills when his drugs that were prescribed by his doctor were denied. United Healthcare is currently fighting a class action lawsuit on the basis of the claim that it uses artificial intelligence to end treatments too early. Critics of the system and of the company in particular say that their profits come in part due to suffering by ordinary Americans. They point out that United Healthcare was rated the worst insurer for denying claims. They turn down 32% of all claims. So you get insurance, you get health insurance with United Healthcare, there's a 1 in 3 chance your claim will be denied. That's twice the industry average of 16%. Like all American insurers, they undergo this ridiculous process of what's called prior authorization, which doesn't exist in most other developed countries, where patients and doctors have to get permission from an insurer before a medical procedure takes place. So how bad would an executive have to be for it to be okay to step outside the institutions of democracy and try to make him pay in some way, even if it were far, far short of assassination? And how do we enact social change in the context of murder always being wrong? If you haven't been online and you haven't been following the reaction to this, or you're outside the United States and this is all kind of news to you, I'll just put some flesh on the bones of what the reaction has been. A commemorative Facebook post by the United Health Group, the parent company of United Healthcare, saying, our thoughts and prayers go out to Brian Thompson and his family, racked up more than 77,000 laughing emojis. Other social media users posted counter condolence messages like, "My empathy is out of network," or "I'm sorry, prior authorization is required for thoughts and prayers." The bullet casings from the bullets that apparently took his life were inscribed with permanent marker that said "depose, deny, and delay." That seems to be a reference to a common anti-private health insurance slogan, delay, deny, defend, which is basically a 3-word summary of the tactics that insurers use to avoid paying out clients in the United States. Delay dealing with a claim, deny the payment, and defend the decision in court. Another person who responded to the shooting was a Columbia University professor, Anthony Zankas, who posted on Twitter, and this post has been liked more than 100,000 times. "Today we mourn the death of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, gunned down, ... Wait, I'm sorry. Today we mourn the deaths of the 68,000 Americans who needlessly die each year so that insurance company execs like Brian Thompson can become multimillionaires." Some of the backdrop to this is that in the 1990s, the consulting firm McKinsey & Company developed new strategies for how private health insurers in the United States could become more profitable and how they could more effectively reduce their costs. Computer systems were designed to generate lowball offers for clients who were basically told to either take it or take them to court. In 2005, the state of Louisiana took on McKinsey, the consulting company, and the insurers who it worked with, one of whom was United Healthcare, arguing in their court case, and I'll quote from the court lodgement here from the state of Louisiana, saying that McKinsey, quote, "engineered a strategy that undervalued insurance claims, allowing insurance companies and their shareholders to reap the profits. Initially, McKinsey advised insurers to stop what's called premium leakage by undervaluing claims using the tactics of deny, delay, and defend. As a result, many insurers began hiring McKinsey. The claim is that United Health staff were pressured to follow an artificial intelligence algorithm's calculations on when to cut off rehabilitation care for elderly patients." Which brings us, I suppose, to the alleged suspect in this case. The New York Times reports that after sifting through some of his online activity, there was a review that he made, a positive reflection or reposting of a post about Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber manifesto, on which an individual had written, which was subsequently reviewed favorably by the suspect, "We live in a capitalist society. I found that the medical industry responds to these key words far more urgently than you describing unbearable pain and how it's impacting your quality of life. These words meaning that you should tell your doctor if you have an illness that it's preventing you from working rather than causing you unbearable pain. Because if you say you're prevented from working, they're more likely to treat you. And the insurer is supposedly more likely to cover you." I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that this is what the suspect was talking about favorably online. In that passage online, the suspect quoted what he described as, quote, "interesting remarks from someone who had written about how companies have zero qualms about burning down the planet for a buck. So why should we have any qualms about burning them down to survive?" The passage went on, quote, "Peaceful protest is outright ignored. Economic protest isn't possible in the current system. So how long until we recognize that violence against those who lead us to such destruction is justified as self-defense. If you know me and you know this show, you know that nothing tempts me more than trying to broach an impossible subject. So rather than just taking it as a given that murder is wrong, I want to understand why it's wrong and under what circumstances it would not be wrong, so that we can properly appreciate some of the ideas that are fueling the far right and potentially contributing to a breakdown of law and order. Tim Dean is the senior philosopher at the Ethics Centre, which is a non-profit that fosters moral conversations about everyday life. He has a PhD in philosophy. He has an expertise in the evolution of morality. He runs philosophy and ethics workshops for businesses. He's a public philosopher and science writer whose first book is called How We Became Human, which is about how our evolved moral minds are out of step with the modern world. Tim Dean's the perfect person to wrestle with these ideas with. Tim Dean, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Josh. Good to be chatting to you.
Is it ever justified to kill someone for a greater good?
Yeah, we go straight in. Yeah, look, I mean, I should preface this by saying, and this will be just like a footnote that'll go under everything that I say, which is that naturally philosophers have thought a lot about this question and they disagree. But there are different ways that we can unpack what it means, because I think what's useful about the philosophical approach is we don't just take a gut reaction or a sense of outrage or justice to be sufficient. We try to find some good reasons. And there have been some who've said, yeah, there are some good reasons to kill in situations where there are bigger issues at stake where not killing would become a problem. So one way that some philosophers have talked about this is what kind of conditions should we have in order to justify violence or killing somebody? And there's a few that come up quite a lot. And I think a lot of philosophers would probably agree that this is some good questions to be asking ourselves before we get into this. And I mean, also just a quick pause there, questions we should be asking ourselves, which kind of separates this decision-making process from a reflexive or a defensive mechanism or a gut outrage mechanism. Like, these are the reasons, and these aren't necessarily in a heat of the moment situation, something we might be able to think through, but can we justify even after the fact? So here are a few. Like, in order to cause any harm to somebody else, where murder or killing is the ultimate harm, we've got to have just cause. We've got to have a good reason to do it. And just cause is usually not going to be because I feel like it or because it benefits me in some way. There's got to be some kind of moral imperative that we can call on. So maybe this person, we might find a moral reason to say they deserve it. We can try to unpack what that means at some point. We could say that the cause is because if I don't do it, something even worse is going to happen. Like, we can imagine a lot of situations. Philosophers had all these thought experiments. Like, if this person has their finger on a trigger for a bomb that is going to imminently kill 1,000 people and I can shoot them, then I shoot them. Another just cause might be survival, self-defense, to say that, I have a right to protect myself. But it's not just having a just cause. We've got to then say, okay, let's say I've got just cause. Let's say I've cleared that threshold. And I mean, there's a lot we could try to unpack there as well. But let's say we clear that threshold. Then I've also got to satisfy another threshold of proportionality. Like, would punching someone in the face, which is still causing them harm, is that going to be sufficient to satisfy the ends? Is that going to prevent the greater harm? Is that going to, help my survival, whatever it is? And because I don't want to be disproportional, I don't want to blow the whole building up just to save another few lives on the outside. But then there's another threshold that we want to get to as well, which is necessity. Is this action of violence necessary? So let's say if there's somebody who we think is contributing to a systemic harm, like, potentially affecting thousands of people, is a violent act necessary, or is another act going to be just as effective in terms of preventing the harm that is motivating me in the first place? So right there, we've got three clauses that we can look to, three thresholds: just cause, proportionality, and necessity. And of course, even if you accept them, you can disagree about what goes on underneath each one of those. But that's a starting point. And I'm not seeing that starting point discussed a lot when it comes to this particular murder in terms of that kind of language.
Yeah, there's another, and this is probably part of, well, I don't know, you tell me where this falls, but the reason I wanted to talk about this and the reason why I started wondering about it was because I heard another podcaster saying, look, it's obviously the case that the world will be worse if people do this sort of thing. Like, this is a person who was generally sympathetic towards the left-wing criticism of people like this CEO, saying like, yeah, no matter how bad what he did is, it's obviously a worse world if we live in a world in which CEOs are being assassinated. And that was where I caught myself and thought, well, hang on. Are we sure? Like, just let's play devil's advocate for a moment. If you lived in a corrupt corporatist system where big insurance companies were in cahoots with the government to screw the little guy, hypothetically, would it be a worse world if those people felt slightly less impunity? Let's just take the AI example, right? Let's suppose that there's a CEO who has deployed an AI that will reliably cause misery and death for 10% of their customers, but raise the company's profits, and that he is able to collude with governments to pull this off and is shameless about it. Is it necessarily a worse world if those CEOs have to be slightly less shameless about doing such things because they have a higher degree of concern for their personal safety and have to spend more on personal security?
Yeah. Is it going to be a better world?
And is that even the right question to ask? I mean, I was just responding to that. Obviously, that's a consequentialist question, right? And we can talk about the difference between, this guy has a right to continue living. Like, if you want to be Kantian about it, like, and in fact, should we just explain sort of these two broad ways of thinking about morality now? Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Like, two of the big tools in the ethical toolkit that have been developed by thinkers for centuries broadly fall into the kind of means view and the ends view. What justifies our action? Is it the means that we take to get to that action, which you could call the Kantian view, or unhelpfully, jargonistically, the deontological view, which says that what makes something the right thing to do is that it adheres to a principle or a duty or a rule. And so, we have a rule. Don't lie to people, don't cheat them, don't kill them, don't murder them. How do you know you're doing the right thing? You're following those kinds of rules. But we can also think of lots of examples where lying to someone might produce a beneficial outcome. So then we start to think about the ends. And that's the consequentialist view. I love it. Philosophers actually named it for what it is. It talks about the consequences and the outcomes. And utilitarianism is probably the most famous version of that, because when you talk about the outcome, you're saying, I'm going to do something. What impact is it going to have upon the world? Is that good or bad? We need to decide, well, what impact matters? Some people talk about pleasure. Some people talk about happiness. Some people talk about preventing suffering. Utilitarians bundle a whole bunch of different things into this one term called utility. And so they're like, okay, we can measure the utility of the world. Well, okay, if we can measure the utility of the world to say, I can do something and it's going to increase a bit of freedom and happiness and reduce suffering, that overall increases the utility. That's what I should do. But again, we can think of examples where I could increase the utility of the world by violating a lot of moral rules. Like, that even go back to, like, I don't know, Plato and his noble lie, to say, you know what, if you just lie to your entire public and give them some false narrative that binds them together and makes them a coherent community and they're all lovely and they're cooperative, that could kind of make a better world. But you're also just like fabricating an entire mythology that is bullshit that you're trying to get everyone to buy into. And a lot of people would be uncomfortable about that. So they're the two kind of broad schools of thought. What's more important, the means or the ends? And
we should probably, I guess, just admit that this conversation is largely going to take place in a consequentialist frame, because if you are a deontologist, there is no starting place for this conversation, really, because a murder took place and murder is against the rules, and therefore it's against the rules. And to me, deontology becomes almost a circular tautological thing. Like, by definition, murder is bad, therefore there's no point in even asking about it. But that doesn't get us very far in terms of people's intuitions. And you're not going to dissuade the Ted Kaczynskis of the world or, whoever shot this CEO by saying murder is wrong. Because they're going to go, well, then why does he get to lead? Why does this CEO get to cause, even if indirectly, the deaths of lots of people, but it's happening inside of a structure of institutions that permit it? I mean, it almost reminds me, Tim, a little bit of the distinction we make between terrorism And war, we get to declare war on Iraq and go in and kill 1 million people, and Dick Cheney can live happily ever after. But if one of those Iraqis tries to resist the occupation by blowing up a Humvee, that's terrorism. Or, look at Israel in Gaza or something. They can kill with impunity, or lead to the deaths of an unacceptable number of Palestinian babies, and that gets coded as warfare. I mean, many people do object to this, but this is precisely the point that they're making. Why does that get coded as warfare, as legitimate? Because it's warfare. But a retaliatory attack that was much smaller but targeted civilians would not. Like the fact that the war reliably leads to the death of civilians should count for at least almost as much as the intentional targeting of civilians. And by that same logic, the fact that a healthcare company's policies to drive up its stock price are reliably going to immiserate people should count for something in the moral calculus alongside extrajudicial killings.
Yeah. Look, and there's a lot there to unpack. So I think when we think about the difference between justified violence and unjustified violence, we would like to think that there are organizations, there are boundaries, there are perhaps institutions that have brought on board, in the case of war, for example, just war theory, which talks about just cause, proportionality, necessity, and that there is a kind of a check and a balance on that, so that we're not relying upon an individual to unilaterally make a decision about these things, but there's a system with an ability to correct it and all that kind of stuff. We want to think that's the case, but we know that that's not always the case. And you could argue that there are some terrorist organizations as well that have systems and principles and rules and say, here's what we're going to do and here's what we're not going to do. So there is an element of, it's not entirely arbitrary, but there's an element of kind of partisanship in terms of the narrative that we present towards particular types of violence based upon the side that we're on and the side that we're rooting for. And so, but putting that aside, I also, there's an interesting distinction as well when it comes to intention, because, and philosophers draw this distinction as well, and it's often, again, the kind of jargon is the doctrine of double effect. It's the idea that it is wrong to intentionally harm somebody for an unjustified end. It may even be wrong to intentionally harm somebody for a justified end. So if, for example, a military says there's a few terrorists hiding in a hospital and we are going to intentionally destroy this hospital, knowing that there are innocent and civilian people in there, and we know as a byproduct of that we're going to prevent, a resource hub or something for the terrorists, we would say the intention to attack a hospital, an intention to attack innocent people is wrong. But if you flip it around and you say, no, our intention is to prevent something really bad from happening or to punish a really, guilty individual, and we know that by doing that, there's going to be a side effect that we're going to be harming some other people. So there's going to be collateral damage, but we're not intending to hurt anybody who's innocent. It's a side effect of our action. It becomes psychologically, and in some philosophers think it's more justifiable to do that action if it's going to, as a side effect, hurt other people. So here, for example, let's draw a distinction between drawing a gun on a healthcare CEO with the intention to kill, and through the killing, the side effect is going to be, one might hope, or the killer might be hoping to change the system and prevent a lot of other harm. Compared to the CEO, who his intention is to raise profits or to respond to, commercial pressures or to whatever that kind of things, or to provide a certain level of healthcare, and unintentionally but knowingly this is going to harm a lot of people. There can also just be a difference between those two. I mean, take it or leave it, right? Some people will say that's not enough. But it's really problematic because there are going to be situations where we want to permit doing something that is going to unintentionally harm other people and say that's the right thing to do. And we are not willing to permit an intentional harm with a side effect.
And look, and our intuition guides us towards that difference. I think we clearly believe that, there's a reason why we have murder versus manslaughter, right? Or why intention matters and the mens rea of the criminal matters in law. I would just note that the critique of that would be that that's a distinction that favors the powerful. Always. because when you're powerful, you get to deploy things in such a way that you can wreak untold havoc. Your levers are just bigger, and therefore you can press a button in Washington, D.C., and a chemical factory, can explode on the other side of the world, which may or may not have been producing chemical weapons, and you reliably know that hundreds of civilians are going to be killed in that, but it wasn't your intent. On the other hand, the powerless person who straps on a backpack bomb and blows up a bus, whilst morally reprehensible, has no other tools of power. Like, that is the only card they're holding in their hand. So the intent thing, I can imagine the powerless looking at that and going, yeah, nice story, bro.
Yeah, look, and power, let's go there, right? Because power, I think, is often neglected in these conversations around ethics. There's a temptation, and I think a lot of ethicists fall into this as well. There's a temptation to say, look, if we can just find the right reasons and explain them to people and have people accept, these reasons, these values, these principles are what we should be following, then people will just do the right thing. But power always gets in the way. Power not only changes what we're capable of doing and what we are prevented from doing, but it also gives a kind of a license to those who set the narrative around what is good and bad, to be able to inhibit other people to be able to do what is in their personal ethical stance. And this is something that's made me really uncomfortable around the whole Thompson murder is, I'm in favor of law and order in principle, when law and order is protecting kind of civil society, where we are able to live without the threat of unilateral violence against people who, others might find morally repugnant, because someone's going to find me morally repugnant, and I don't particularly want them to have the ability to just, gun me down. So this is the bargain that we have in civil society, is that we're going to try to resolve our differences through means other than violence. And so we delegate violence to, the institutions with checks and balances to be able to do that, But in this situation like this, I've felt uncomfortable by appealing to the law and order response to say, this is wrong, and we should catch the killer and punish them appropriately. If the law and order response is the thing that is now just protecting a corrupt system, is protecting a system that not only, because there's a double layer of corruption. There's not only about a system that causes or doesn't prevent harm, it's a system that doesn't allow itself to be changed. And this is a key part of this civil bargain, to say, I'm going to give up my right to shoot other people if they give up their right to shoot mine. If we've got some organization that's going to watch over us and use force to prevent things bad, from happening. But if that system itself is open for me to be able to criticize it, change it, make sure that it's working as intended, and if it's not working as intended, I need to have civil means to be able to rectify that. And in the absence of those civil means to make the system work, to make it just, then I'm worried that going to the standard thing of saying, law and order is the right response here, is still failing because the civil bargain has been, they've already failed on the civil side, on the institutional side. So who am I actually supporting here? Am I just now entrenching the harm that's caused by corrupt organization?
Yeah. And even though a lot of the criticisms of the healthcare industry in the wake of the assassination have come from the left, what you're pointing to is really resonant with the revolution that's happened on the right, from a small c conservatism of the George H.W. Bush era, I guess, or the Reagan era, institutionalists, elites really, to the kind of far right, both the far right in Europe and also the Make America Great Again kind of Trump movement, is a really counter-institutional. Look, appointing, someone who hates the FBI to run the FBI, for example, is, one of Trump's moves now. It's a counter-institutional, anti-elite movement that is obviously growing out of a sense, especially in America, but sort of everywhere, that actually the tools that we would normally use to enact our will on those systems and make them democratically responsive and reactive are broken. We're pulling levers and nothing's happening. Like, there's just a cabal of people, of rich people and powerful people who are making decisions for us. And at that point, that's when I think the plausibility or the credibility of ideas like the ones that we're sort of tiptoeing around become more loom larger for people, become more viable for people, and that opens the door to violence. I mean, you can imagine a scenario, you can think of a society like Chile under Pinochet or some other right-wing authoritarian that leans on the importance of upholding institutions and law and order as a way to screw everybody over. You can imagine a hypothetical in which, like, let's just play with the dials a little bit, Tim, on the actual scenario here to see where we get to a point at which public harm or retaliation could be morally permissible. Like, let's suppose that insurance companies in America were in cahoots with doctors at hospitals to provide them with kickbacks to terminate early expensive patients' lives who are in the hospital. We know the patient's never going to leave. They've probably got another 8 months lying on life support. Let's just make that 3 months or 2 weeks, and you get a holiday in the Bahamas, courtesy of the health insurer, right? Would the families of those victims be permitted to step out of the democratic institutional system and say, it's not good enough for you to expect me to write letters to my, congressional representative or my senator about this. I want to, send threatening letters about the CEO's children to him, contaminate the fuel supply of his private jet so that it encounters problems in the air and has to make an emergency landing somewhere, inconvenience him in some other way, replace his organic meals with with slightly poisoned meals that will decrease his life expectancy by a few months or years. Like, is all of that out of bounds because we all have to play by the rules?
Yeah, look, let's play with that, right? So let's say the letter writing campaigns have come to naught. Let's say that I keep voting and nothing ever changes. So let's say that, I'm trying to do the right thing and I'm trying to protect protect the life of a loved one. And I'm sure there are many people in the United States who felt exactly that feeling of saying, I'm outraged because a loved one is suffering and potentially dying because of this. What can we do? And so let's say on those 3 clauses that I had before, we've got just cause, we've got proportionality, and we've got necessity. We've got just cause to do something. And so what do we do? Let's look at the proportionality. And this is the question you're going to. It's like, where do we draw that threshold? And I got to say, there is a really useful distinction between violence and force.
Okay.
And there was I was reading a paper where in the US in 1969, there was a student sit-in. They were occupying an administration building, and a bunch of high-level university people, the deans, were trapped within. And the deans were escorted outside by security, and someone on the side of the deans yelled out, "You're using violence against these university people." And one of the student protesters was like, "No, we're not. We're using force. Force is a form of coercion. We are changing someone's behavior in a way that they wouldn't automatically behave that way. We're pushing them to behave in a different way."
Man, if they think dragging people out physically is not violence, they should get a load of the social justice warriors on campus these days who say that words are violence. That's a whole other.
But this is where in the 1960s, the discourse and the change in the usage of the word violence hadn't expanded. And so there was a push to change the nature of violence, to not just talk about an individual act, but to talk about systems. Take it or leave it. I'm not sure that's a useful change of language.
Right. And you'll also often hear, far leftists deny that property damage is violence. I think in common parlance, we would think about a brick through the window of a shop as being violent, but you'll often hear communist people who still use the label of communist saying that's not, attacking property is not violence. Attacking humans is violence.
Yeah, and it becomes a matter of semantics of like, where do we draw the line around violence? I mean, if you define violence as being like an aggressive, sharp act to cause damage and harm, I mean, you could do that more widely, or you could shrink it down. But force, I think, is useful because violence is a form of force because you're coercing someone or changing the behavior, maybe ending their behavior by ending their life in a way that they wouldn't do automatically. And so there are lots of ways that we can force people to change their behavior, to protect people we love, or to fix the systemic injustices or whatever that is. And I think you could set that bar to say, I'm going to step in and do something to force someone to stop harming a family member. I'm going to, you could even say, I'm going to picket their place of work so they're not even able to function effectively, so they can't do the act to be able to prevent it. I'm going to let down their tires so they can't get to the place they would need to get to cause the harm that they, I think all of those kinds of step levels where you're saying, I'm not exercising more force, because you get that other clause, which is necessity. I'm doing just what is necessary, and I'm still exerting force. I'm still making them do something they don't want to do. I'm still harming them in some way, but it's not necessarily stepping up to violence. Because, when you step to violence outside of the state, when individuals get their hands dirty by acting on violence, I think this has been discussed, but I'll say it again. The danger is you're taking that decision to enact violence out of the hands of an institution ostensibly with checks and balances. May or may not be using them, but ostensibly there's some process to decide whether violence is warranted, and putting it in the hands of an individual. And the problem with putting it in the hands of an individual, particularly in the increasingly fragmented and tessellated and diverse moral and social world that we live in today, is the moral agent can be willing to sacrifice anything or to kill anybody in order to see their will done. And that's too much power to be putting in the hands of people who don't have the checks and balances around them. So we don't want that bar to be set so low that violence goes into that breakdown of the civil bargain to say, now it's up to me to defend myself. This is why I think...
Yeah, sorry, finish that thought.
Well, just the quick thought is, this is why I think this story is so interesting. It's such an American story. It's about this systemic failure of healthcare system. It's such an American thing in the modern world. It's about the failure of politics to correct this system, which is also an American thing. Americans hate Congress, and yet it's just they feel unable to change it. It's also a very American story to take things into your own hands. I immediately thought about that Michael Douglas film, Falling Down, from the 90s, where this guy's just trying to get home to see his daughter, and the system keeps getting in his way, and he keeps trying to do the right thing, and he eventually gets more and more violent as he's trying to do it. And we see him as an anti-hero, but there's still a hero there, right?
It starts with the burger at a burger joint, which doesn't look like the beautiful picture of the burger on the sign, and he gets this sloppy thing and starts beating the place up, right? The great line in that movie is his final line when Robert Duvall, who plays the cop, has him in a showdown and finally has him cornered. Michael Douglas looks at him and goes, "I'm the bad guy?"
Yeah, right. And this is what I don't want people to be in that situation, right? But if they're in that situation and I'm the one they're pointing the gun at, I don't want them thinking, am I the bad guy after they've shot me?
Right.
So that's where we want to set the bar high. But yeah, what can be permissible? I think exerting force. And there's a lot of literature on civil disobedience as a form of coercive, forcing an institution to change or that kind of thing. But the difference, and this is a really key difference, maybe we could talk about this a bit more as well, is unilateral action only by definition requires one person to execute that action. Whereas civil disobedience is a collective action, and you need a lot of people to move at the same time to make something happen. And that's much, much harder to do. I would say, I've said before, I actually think we've got solutions to most of the world's problems. We know, actually, I think a lot of Americans know how to fix the healthcare system. What they can't do is solve the problem of how to get enough people moving at the same time in order to overcome the inertia to make that happen. And so I think today, in today's world, another thing that's is contributing to the breakdown and encouraging unilateral action is the fragmented nature and the polarized nature of society means that it's harder to get a big enough group of people to move at once to actually have enough force to overcome the inertia to change things.
Let's just pause there on unilateral action then, because the whole argument of the terrorist or the assassin in these kinds of situations, when we're talking about a crusader type mentality and not just a nihilist, but someone who's trying to presumably achieve something, they're revolutionaries, right? And their argument would be that the institutions aren't like it would sound to them like what you're saying is that no revolution is ever justified, right? Like that no attempt to step outside of the institutions is ever justified unless it is peaceful. But like, was the first intifada in Gaza, where people rose up en masse, and tried to push back against their occupation justified? Like, was the American Revolution or the French Revolution justified? This was people taking into their own hands a commitment to commit violence in the interests of overthrowing an unjust system and implementing something better.
Yeah, and let me stress that while I would always be in favor of peaceful or non-violent resistance where that can work, there will be certainly places where it won't work, where the system is corrupt, the system is not only corrupt and unjust and harmful, but it does not allow itself to be corrected. And even non-violent action is not going to do it. So yes, violence can be justified. Collective violence can be justified. But when you look at the French Revolution, you look at the American Revolution, you usually have a group of thinkers agonizing over what we should be doing and how we should be doing it, and trying to temper the violent outburst, the outrage motivated violence that could easily take over a mob, to try to direct it towards constructive ends. And we can see how fragile that is and how difficult that is. You look at the repercussions of the French Revolution. So yeah, I mean, violent revolution can be necessary when the system absolutely refuses to allow itself to be changed.
Right. But we are nowhere near that in the United States. And I mean, the other thing, lest it be misunderstood that I'm arguing for the justness of this particular killing, which I'm not. The other thing that strikes me as useful in trying to wrestle through this is the recognition of the basic immorality, I think, of using another person as a tool to achieve your desired ends, right? I mean, what's strangely awful about the kind of terrorist or assassin's mindset, this crusader mindset, is that it takes an individual human being and it makes them an instrument, essentially. Which is precisely what life, and makes them an instrument for a higher end. On what basis do you have the right to enroll that person into your vision of an America that has a more just healthcare system?
Yeah.
Like, I understand that you think that he's complicit, but what's your standing for enlisting his family in the mission of having to spend the rest of their lives grieving for their husband and father? Like that, to me, it's, I don't know. Help me through the ethics of this, because it reminds me, and maybe this is an unfair comparison to make towards Australian governments, but the thing that has always stuck in my craw about the Australian attitude towards policing our borders is that we essentially make examples of people who tried to come here illegally on boats in order to deter other people. And a plausible case can be made, and is made by successive Australian governments, that people's lives are saved on net by the existence of a very, very brutal Australian immigration regime, where our Navy intercepts boats before they reach Australian waters. We bribe small Pacific Island nations to build concentration camps, and we deposit those people in them, and they rot there for the rest of their lives, or they can be sent to other countries, but they're never going to set foot in Australia. And the argument is that only affects several scores or hundreds of people, and thousands of people don't die in hazardous voyages trying to get to Australia because the people smuggling industry dries up completely. It makes a certain utilitarian consequentialist sense, but there's something in my gut that says you don't get to use people that way. You don't, once they're in your care, you have a duty of care over them, and they shouldn't be, sewing their lips shut on hunger strikes in order to get your attention about what your government is doing to them, even if it leads to a net gain. They're not just tools to achieve another outcome. They have a sanctity in themselves.
Yeah, and this is where the language you're using right now is the Kantian language. It is the deontological language, which is the temper to consequentialist language. So one of the principles that Kant and others would say is non-instrumentalism. Do not use other people as an instrument to achieve an end that you want to achieve. And Kant famously said, treat people as ends unto themselves rather than a means to an end. And it's particularly perverse if people are sewing their mouths shut, that actually becomes more beneficial for the consequentialist view, because the more images of people sewing their mouths shut you can send overseas, the more it might dissuade people from trying to cross the borders. So this is where a deliberate or being complicit in causing harm and using people, setting an example. I mean, think about back to when we're all in school and someone, us, maybe somebody else, a bunch of people are talking, acting up or whatever, and the teacher makes an example of one person. So I'm going to really punish this person hard in an unjustifiable way because we know that they weren't the only person involved here, but that's going to set an example and stop other people from misbehaving. And that is, I don't have an answer to that. I actually don't have an answer to that, because you go one way and the consequentialists would say, hey, look, if it reduces misbehavior, if it reduces people dying in rickety boats coming to Australia, then it's worth it. But then the deontologist in me, and there are both of them in everybody, is saying, I don't want to be using other people to achieve these ends. So, I mean, so from the Ethics Centre perspective, where I work, we look at all of these different ethical theories, as well as things like virtue ethics, and we look at existentialist ethics, and we look at the ethics of care that comes from Carol Gilligan. We look at all these different approaches that are often in tension with each other and contradictory as a toolkit that you pull out, and you acknowledge, when I'm using this hammer, maybe a screwdriver, might have a different answer to this, but I can't just use a hammer to solve this kind of problem. And I mean, people hate it when I say this, but we have to just sit with an incomplete solution sometimes and have a conversation and continually revise and reflect and be critical and talk about it, but not be glib and not just fall into allowing knee-jerk reactions or emotional or outrage to be the only force that is making our decisions. But we need to have good reasons. So, yeah, the non-instrumentalism, I think, is a really important kind of feature of this. But there are some times where treating someone as a means to an end might be worth it. So it's not going to be a black and white.
What would such a scenario be?
Well, look, the easy example would be the guy with the trigger and the bomb, and I'm going to save lives by doing that. That might
that's
be
not making an example of him, is it?
No, that's too easy.
That's
an
actual.
Right.
That's a direct consequentialist thing. I mean, I guess my mind goes to maybe the death penalty for drug importation in some East Asian countries, maybe. But I still don't think it's
a better example.
A great idea. But having a very obvious public shooting of somebody who was importing cocaine.
So let me give you an example where there's a really interesting discussion around what's the appropriate level of punishment that we should inflict upon somebody when they've done something wrong. And kind of, if you just take it on the really rarefied, abstract way of thinking about the appropriate punishment, assuming that it works as a deterrent and all that kind of stuff, it's just like just enough harm to stop that person from doing it again so that it's not worth their time, just enough harm that it's visible enough that other people will see that it's not worth their time to do it and all that kind of stuff, but no more. But even if you accept that, even if you accept that the deterrent factor of punishment is going to be useful there, you say, well, what if there are 1,000 people committing a crime and they're really hard to catch? So you only catch 1 in 1,000 people committing this particular crime. In order for it to be a sufficient deterrent, maybe we have to punish that person more, make an example of them. Because if we could just catch all 1,000 and just punish them a little bit, or even catch 500 of them, punish them just enough, it'll be enough of a deterrent that someone else thinks, well, I'm not going to get away with it. I'm probably going to get 50-50 chance I'll get caught and this bad thing's going to happen to me, so I won't do it.
Tim, we just got interrupted by a digital glitch, and so we froze for a moment. But, part of this that intrigues me is the mindset of people who are kind of messianic in the way that they're trying to change the world, whether that's inside institutions, inside government, inside companies, or outside it, like a renegade assassin. There's a very compelling kind of narrative, moral narrative, that goes along the lines of, I'm willing to do the things that nobody else is willing to do. I'm the person who identifies the problem that everybody knows exists and nobody else has the stomach to take on. And I am one of the few chosen people who has the gumption to take it on myself and get my hands dirty. And you will all condemn me, but secretly you'll also love me. I can feel the tug.
Yeah. Well, I call this the Batman approach. So Batman, I mean, look, in comic book, people are going to have different views on this, but here's my riff.
That's
right?
not the point of this conversation. To the comic book nerds.
I know. It's the philosopher in me. I whenever I speak, there's like 4 other voices of people I know. Kind of, well, actually, so I kind of have to just put them to the side for a moment. And they're normally philosophers. In this case, they're people who read.
Right, yeah, Peter Parker actually.
Yeah, who actually? So, but the Batman thing, the way I think about Batman is like, here's my view. Superman is a deontologist. Batman is a consequentialist. Superman is really powerful. He can do anything. So what defines his moral view are the limits that he places on his actions, the duties that he feels like he is bound to, and the restraint that he exercises based upon principle. And Batman, though, is working in a corrupt system in a place that's, run by crime gangs and all this kind of stuff. Nothing's being done about it. And he's like, I'm going to do something about it. But in doing so, I'm going to compromise certain things that I care about. I'm going to turn myself into a monster. I'm going to use violence to get these ends. I'm going to go outside of the law. I've already decided that the law is not enough. I'll work with when I can, but I'm not going to I'm not going to lobby and vote and use my enormous wealth to create good. I'm going to go and get my hands dirty in order to do the right thing. And so he's, in a way, he's this figure. He's saying, I will become the monster to make the world a better place so that you don't have to. And that's all good and well until you get Batman's rivals and villains who often have the same kind of idea. But their morality is a little bit different, and therein lies the problem. But the Dirty Hands, I think, the Dirty Hands kind of vigilante is a narrative that I think we all kind of understand, and sometimes we want. And there's a bit of cowardice in us saying we want it because it's like we're not willing to do it. We're not willing to go and get our hands dirty to see justice done, but we're willing to applaud someone who does have the courage to do that.
Your point about the villains reminds me of one of the great villains of 21st century cinema, which is the Heath Ledger version of the Joker in The Dark Knight, who is a counterpart to Batman and goes one step further and says, you think that you're so high and mighty because you're fighting crime, but in reality nothing matters, and even you are a hypocrite. So let me put you through this series of moral conundrums, like the 2 ferries that are parked on the harbour with this classic kind of prisoner's dilemma about which one is going to, if one of them blows the other one up, then they all, I can't even remember the exact contours of the dilemma, but these quite sophisticated sort of, ethics 101 conundrums that the Joker poses to try to tease out whether or not Batman really is all that, or whether he's just as full of shit as everybody else. I mean, in a strange way, there's a parallel between the assassin or terrorist's heroic logic here and the reasoning of some people who work inside institutions like Dick Cheney. I'm thinking of the rhetoric around the war on terror after 9/11 did kind of tiptoe up to the edge of stop asking questions about whether or not what we're doing in Guantanamo Bay is good or bad or constitutional or unconstitutional or torture or not torture. Like, we're willing to do the things that keep you safe. We're willing to stand up and get our hands dirty when you are not. It reminds me also of the final scene of A Few Good Men, which I don't know if you remember, but Jack Nicholson's character, Colonel Jessup, is the bad guy who's a senior military guy who has this amazing, memorable speech when Tom Cruise is prosecuting him for the death of one of the people who was under his care, a military guy. And he's basically saying, you sleep at night because of the protection that people like me provide you. You live in a society, in a culture that's surrounded by walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. And now you have the intemperance and impunity to question the manner in which I provide the very security that gives you the ability to question it, like sort of how dare you kind of thing.
You have the luxury of not knowing what I know, that Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives, and my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall.
And I feel that same logic in application in the Unabomber's manifesto or in the supposed rationale of the suspect in this CEO's assassination.
Yeah. And I'm sympathetic to that idea that there are things that we require to live the comfortable, safe lives that we have that are neither comfortable nor safe in their execution. But then you get that other old question of like, who watches the watchers? It's not a matter of Dick Cheney saying, do not question our methods. Rather, he could say, our methods work, our methods are keeping you safe, but do question them, because it's in the questioning of them that you're able to see that they work, see that they're safe, to see that we are executing it with proportionality, with necessity. The risk is, and this is always the risk, I mean, to invoke another political philosopher from the ages, another dead white guy, Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan. He said civil war is the worst of all outcomes, people fighting against each other. And if we have no governance, then it's just a war of all against all. Everyone's just fighting each other for their thing. So what we need is a Leviathan. We need this strong sovereign state that is unquestioned in its authority and power to keep the peace. And that's kind of where Cheney's going, right? He's like, we are the unquestioned power. Just trust us, we'll keep the peace. But how can you trust the Leviathan? You can't. And so that's why after Hobbes came people like John Locke and liberalism, which is about transparency. And that transparency and accountability is what matters. And that's I think, kind of what people are getting at with the assassination of Thompson is, where's the accountability? So in the discourse around civil disobedience, one of the things around civil disobedience, like Gandhi and others, is to say, we are going to break the law. We're going to go outside the law. We're told not to do this, and we're going to push back against this because we think it's justified. But we are also going to accept the consequences of our actions. We are going to be visible in what we do. We're going to be accountable for what we do. And if we allow the non-violence to slip into violence, we are going to be responsible for that. And that's, I mean, he's perhaps a moral hero in the sense that he's taking more on his shoulders than we can expect of most. And a lot of people would say that his methods wouldn't have worked in a lot of other situations. But it's the lack of transparency around the lone actor and their execution of their moral will. That's what worries me.
And would that be the main counterpoint then, to wrap up? We only have 2 minutes left here, Tim, but if the point of this conversation is to try to complicate our easy moral understanding of murder and shine some light on the tragedy of this assassination by actually addressing rather than tiptoeing around the central moral conundrum, if there were a Ted Kaczynski or whoever the assassin is in this particular case, I'm saying whoever because there hasn't been a trial yet, then what would you say to such a person to dissuade them from their claim that they're doing the right thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough because also I'm aware there are lots of moral things that I could say. I could say, is this the proportional response? Is there something else you can do? Can you use force or coercion without violence? Is there some way that you can get collective action, get a group of people together such that you can have a critical mass of activity? Is this really necessary? Is this just an expression of your outrage, your very justifiable outrage at an unjust system? Is this just to satisfy that outrage rather than to actually produce a beneficial outcome? But I expect a lot of those would fall on deaf ears if you're stopping him from drawing a gun from his waistband or something. You need to get in earlier than that. I'm not sure there's much that can be said rationally at that moment, but earlier there can be things that we can do to talk about, okay, what world do we want to live in? What's the outcome that we want to see? How do we get there? And let us not accept these false narratives of, law and order being all bad because it protects the powerful, or all good because it prevents assassinations. Let's step into some ambiguity. Let's step into some difficulty and use a toolkit to be able to solve that problem. And it's probably glib, right? Because I don't know how to solve the systemic injustices in the world. I wish I did. And I wish just words could do that. But perhaps if I were standing nearby and saw someone draw a gun, I would hope to have the courage to be able to stop an act of violence, but also have the courage to be able to then work with that person to try to solve those kinds of problems on a larger level. But I'm not even sure I would have the courage to do that. I think I'd probably run away, as the bystander did in that situation, because that's the prudent thing to do in that situation. Philosophy can help us justify it, and it can help us understand and unpack and give reasons, but it doesn't necessarily give us the tools to change people's behavior in a single conversation.
Well, Tim, if it's any reassurance, I would have leapt onto the assassin and I would have saved the situation, obviously, because I'm a clandestine superhero. I think the takeaway is don't kill people, folks. It's not the best solution to things, but it's worth understanding why some people think that it is the best solution to things so that we can progress from there. Tim Dean, thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Josh.